Hello, and welcome to the Sustainability Leaders Podcast, part of the Jobs with Impact compendium of resources for people who want to make a positive impact on the world. I'm David Rosenheim, your host. Every episode, we bring you in-depth conversations with people who are leading the way to a sustainable future. I hope these conversations will be as inspiring to you as they are to me. And most of all, I hope that they'll empower you to take action. The planet needs you. You can learn more about this and other episodes by going to jobswithimpact.com. Please help us to spread the word by taking a minute to rate and review the show in iTunes and by telling your friends and colleagues. Many of us know Katherine Hamilton as the co-host of the Energy Gang podcast, but did you know that she got her foundation in energy policy by training in electrical engineering at community college and also studying civilization and culture at the Sorbonne? Her career is just as interesting, spanning program implementation at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory to co-chairing the Global Future Council on Advanced Energy Technologies at the World Economic Forum in Davos. Katherine is expert in energy policy at the state, federal, and international level, and has deep experience in technologies ranging from bioenergy to smart grid, and from energy storage to demand-side management. I think you'll enjoy our conversation. Katherine Hamilton, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks. It's great to be here.
Great to have you on this rainy San Francisco day.
I wouldn't have it any other way.
Yeah. Well, we both had our challenges getting in. So I want to start with your origin. And I know you're from Virginia, born in Richmond, raised in Lynchburg. Tell me what it was like growing up there.
So one thing that is so deeply seated for me is the sound of the train whistle and the mountains. That's what I think of when I think of my childhood, and the smell of magnolia. So I liked growing up there. Of course, I didn't know any different. It's really beautiful. Then again, I haven't lived there since I left for college because I wanted to get out. But I think it was a great place to be raised.
And did your childhood, or how did your childhood inform your sense of environment?
Well, so my dad is a professor of philosophy. He's actually one of the top 50 living philosophers in the world. Wow. He just got a Fulbright, and I'm really, really proud of him. So he was a philosophy professor that before my brother and I could leave the dining room table, we had to do a logic problem.
So is logic his...
That was part of it, but he does a lot more now. And then my mom really spent time raising, there were 4 kids at the time. And then eventually when the family split apart, she went on and had a great career in public relations. But they were very much political activists. So, they were big Ralph Nader fans. My first concert was Pete Seeger. I remember canvassing for McGovern with my mother when I was a little girl. So they were very, very politically active, especially my mother. She was really into just getting out and making a difference. Lynchburg is a very diverse community, about 50% Caucasian, 50% African American. And I grew up in public schools. And so I was always raised in a community that was extremely diverse. So going out to other parts of the country that were not diverse was surprising to me.
A pretty unique place, it sounds like, to grow up. And I love the poetic train whistle and magnolia blossoms in the air. So which maybe informs your at least your undergraduate at Cornell studying English. I'm also an English, at least undergrad. But you also studied electrical engineering at community college, and you went to the Sorbonne. I also went to the Sorbonne for a while and studied culture and civilization.
Yes.
So these are pretty disparate academic fields. What did you take from sort of this combination that you bring into your work now, or that you brought into your career?
I wanted to go to Cornell because my dad had been on sabbatic there, and I loved Ithaca. So I had spent 8th grade going to public school in Ithaca, and I really loved it. And I was so excited to go there. It's beautiful and has natural gorges, and it's just a really nice place. And I really wanted to either be a teacher or write and illustrate children's books. So I majored in creative writing. And then I went to the Sorbonne to have an adventure. I went to Paris because I didn't know what else I wanted to do. But in between, in the summers, I worked for the utility in Virginia, in Richmond, which was then Virginia Power.
What led to that choice, though? Was it just a job that was available to you, or did you have a specific interest?
So my grandfather was an executive in the utility. He had started out as a surveyor on a truck and had worked his way up to executive vice president. And in his mind, the utility was the company. He just called it the company. You got to come work for the company. I was like, well, I'm not an engineer. I can't work for the company. But I did do technical writing in my summers. And then when I tried to find a job, and it was not going to be in writing and illustrating children's books after I got back from Paris, I went back and applied to the utility. And they were desperate for people who could do engineering. So I applied. I got a job because I'd had some track record with them, so they knew I was at least an eager employee. And I ended up having to take tests every 6 months to make sure I could prove my mettle on all of the calculations, guying calculations. I was doing circuit conversions, upgrading circuits, designing French drains and vaults. I mean, this is a serious design business, and taking electrical engineering at night. And that was how I was able to learn the business. And I found that I loved it. I absolutely loved learning how things worked. I feel like I was the engineer that my grandfather wanted somebody in the family to be without actually having an engineering degree.
And you went on to work for quite a while at Dominion, right?
Yeah, I was there for sort of a decade in total. And I did, everything from, designing grids to doing a lot of energy efficiency thermal storage. We were selling ice storage then in the late 80s, early 90s. It was a really interesting time for the utility because we couldn't build out substations and feeder lines fast enough. We had plenty of baseload power production with our nuclear plants. We had pumped hydro also for storage. But we could not build lines fast enough. So we had to be super creative with energy efficiency. And that was so interesting to me. I had really been very environmentally driven. And part of that was fed in college during the whole the No Nukes concert. All of that was really big in college, and I really got into it. And so I was very driven to be do something environmental. And the utility had so many interesting things going on that was very stimulating. And I learned a lot there. I still would say the utility is the best place to learn the business.
So it's interesting because efficiency now is really part of climate policy. And then, it sounds like, at least from your perspective, it was achieving some sort of environmental aim. But for the utility, it was really market-driven, of course, right? Because, as you said, they weren't able to build lines fast enough. So how, at that time, did you see more broadly within the utility and within the industry, sort of the environment and energy convergence happening, or was it happening at that time?
I don't remember at the time being driven by environmentalism at all. It was really driven by the need to serve a really, really booming economy. And at that time, I was assigned to Old Town Alexandria, and it was during this huge building boom where all these high rises were going up. And all of the work was driven by trying to make sure we could serve all of these customers with electricity. I always, in the back of my mind, thought I'm also doing good things for the environment because I'm helping to save energy and use it smarter and better while I'm doing this.
And what was happening sort of on the policy front with efficiency? Were you tracking policy at that time?
I was doing nothing on policy. I didn't do anything in policy until I was very far along in a career at the National Renewable Energy Lab. And that was when a friend of mine came to me and said, hey, I'm the policy person and I'm about to leave. Would you like to do this? Would you have any interest in taking this job over as manager of government relations? And I had no idea what that meant.
Well, talk to me for a second about that transition from Dominion to NREL. What drove that, and what work were you initially doing at NREL?
There were a couple of interesting drivers. One is that I really wanted to do much more environmental and I would say renewable energy work, and we weren't doing that much. The other piece was, quite frankly, when I was pregnant with my second child, I was told I should probably not be working by the utility. I knew that I had hit the glass ceiling and I would not go anywhere. And I wanted to go somewhere. I wanted to keep growing in the utility. I really liked it. I really liked the work. At that time, it just wasn't, the attitudes were really different toward women who had children.
So that was an explicit glass ceiling, or was it sort of, I mean, how was that conveyed to you?
We were in a staff meeting and my boss said, I hope that motherhood doesn't prevent us from making our goals this year. That explicit.
Yeah.
So what I did was I started putting out some feelers. I happened to walk by one of the legitimate engineers' desks, and in his inbox was a memo from somebody at Department of Energy named Mark Ginsburg, who ran the Federal Energy Management Program that helps all the federal agencies become more efficient and deploy renewables. And I saw this guy's name and I thought, he seems really interesting. I'm going to send him a note or give him a call. And I did, and I applied, and he became my mentor and hired me through NREL. So I was really assigned to the Department of Energy, but through the lab.
So I love that process of just, finding something that's interesting, somebody that is a viable point of contact, and actually having the gumption to make the call. Was that something that you did frequently, or was that sort of a one-shot?
My mother would tell anyone that I was very sassy as a child, but I went through a really very shy period where, like, in elementary school, I wouldn't come out of the coat room. I was so shy. So I don't remember being sassy, but I do think I was fearless in some ways. So going to Paris on my own, and I took a bunch of odd jobs to be there and did just some nutty things. And I feel like that was, I was fearless. And so I thought, well, let me take this chance. It's okay. I can, what could possibly go wrong?
So what was your first role then at NREL? What were you doing?
So my job was to start an energy audit program for federal facility managers. So I had to write a proposal for, audit companies. I had to run a source solicitation and try to do all of this review of different audit companies that wanted to be approved by the federal government. And in the process of that, I really wanted to know a lot more about energy efficiency. I had done a lot at the power company, but because I didn't have my professional engineer certificate and that title, I instead decided, well, I can't do that because I don't have a degree in engineering, but I could be a certified energy manager. And so that was how I was able to get certified and have legitimacy when I went in and talked to facility managers at federal sites, was that I took a course and took a test and passed it and became a CEM. And that, when I walked in, that meant that I had some credibility when I talked to people. I also realized while I was there doing energy efficiency that water was so closely tied. So I also started a water efficiency program while I was there. And I did my crowning achievement was convincing the Assistant Secretary of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy, who was a woman, to come and do a press conference in front of a waterless urinal.
Wow.
I did a study on waterless urinals. I know more than anybody should.
So what factoids can you share about waterless urinals?
They save water.
Yeah, as one would hope.
And women still don't use them.
Yeah. So did the federal government at that time have any explicit targets for energy efficiency or for its buildings?
Yeah, so this was early in the Clinton administration. So there was an executive order on energy efficiency and renewable energy, and there was authority given to do energy savings performance contracts that were going to become the financing mechanisms for getting these projects done. And they still do those. They now have a lot more on the utility side too, agreements with utilities, but all of that still exists. They're still doing that. Now, of course, they haven't done enough and fast enough, but the program at FEMP is a really great program. It's something that hasn't gotten much, accolades within the Department of Energy because it just does its job. But it was a great place to be for more training.
And what were the sort of priorities? I mean, we always talk about low-hanging fruit in energy efficiency. At that time, it might have been actually low-hanging fruit compared to where we are now. I mean, what were the programs that were yielding the most benefit? What were the priority programs?
The trick was not to just change light bulbs. We all knew changing light bulbs, that was the low-hanging fruit. But what we were trying to get agencies to do was to bundle projects. So at that time, solar was a lot more expensive, but if you bundled it with energy efficiency lighting, and heating and air conditioning, you could then make it cost effective in a financial product. It was really hard to get agencies to do that. They still mostly just did lighting retrofits. But we worked really hard to try to get them to do other things, whether it was CHP or rooftop solar, whatever that was. We wanted them to bundle those projects. I think certainly they do that a lot more now. This was a long time ago, but that was something we were trying to do and thought the financing mechanism of an energy savings performance contract would enable them to.
And when you were at NREL, did you have exposure to some of the research being done on renewable technologies as well?
Yeah, so at first my focus was very much, I was in DC, my focus was on agencies, and to be honest, I spent most of my time traveling to sites where agencies were, where different federal facilities were, and talking to whether it was the facilities person at Fort Leavenworth or whatever the agency was, or some postal service building or a GSA building. Like, I was mostly out in the field. But when my friend came to me and said, "Hey, would you like to try government relations?" And I said, "Yeah, that seems really interesting." I then got to learn all about all the other research programs, which of course was fascinating to me because I'd always been fascinated in technology. So I went out and spent a lot of time with each of the business lines, like whether it was the PV or biofuels or wind departments, like seeing the technology, seeing how it worked and talking to those folks, because I knew then that I had to represent what they were doing to Congress.
And how would you describe sort of the tenor of Congress's appetite for some of these technologies, and maybe comparing it to to where we are today, which might be quite a bit different?
It was nonpartisan. I was asked by the Republicans on the Science Committee, who, by the way, now don't believe in science. The Republicans invited me to testify on behalf of renewable energy. That tells you a lot right there. On the Republican side, there was a member of Congress, Vern Ehlers, who was a physicist from Michigan. They were asking really smart questions. They cared about technology. Now, again, it was at the point where it was very much in the R&D phase. So it wasn't an industry as much as it is today. But it was certainly something everybody was interested in. I didn't feel like there was any partisan slant, and we were able to get funding increases on the floor of the House, even during when Gingrich was the speaker. Early on, we were able to do that in a very nonpartisan way.
So it just hadn't been politicized yet.
Yeah, it was definitely not as political as it is now.
Yeah, and just skipping around a little bit, because I want to stick with NREL for one sec before we kind of move on in your career. What's happening today with NREL and in today's administration?
So I'm not there anymore, but I have talked to some folks, and the research continues. I mean, Congress still funds it, still funds these programs. There's a big analysis shop. There's a lot of modeling. And one of the things that NREL and other labs are able to do is not just rely on a stream of funding from the Department of Energy, but they can do partnerships with corporates. They can do work for others, for other agencies. So all of our national labs are just amazing. They are our treasures on innovation. And so all of those labs are viewed as incredibly valuable, even beyond the government. And so a lot of them have been able to market to outside entities to make sure that they still have a steady stream of funding. But even with the administration taking certain postures on fossil versus renewables, NREL seems to be in a pretty good place.
So you don't see its sort of the threat to science in general affecting sort of the lifeblood, the federal funding for the national labs. This is something I haven't looked at real specifically. So these are kind of general questions.
Yeah. So I don't think we've seen it spin out yet. So far, Congress has not taken the administration's request for funding, which is to zero out a lot of these programs.
Right.
So Congress says, no, we still think this is important to do. So I think in that way, we haven't seen a lot of change. Now, that's not to say if this kept up for a long period of time that it wouldn't have a huge impact. But my understanding is so far they're all hanging in.
Okay. So after NREL, you sort of built on your experience on the project and program side, and also this role that you had at NREL in government relations to really focus on policy exclusively. And you went on to help lead several sector-specific trade organizations, right? In the Bioenergy Association, the Gridwise Alliance, and the Energy Storage Association. It's a little bit of a tongue twister. And you took on different roles. You were taking on senior leadership roles in these organizations. So how is this transition for you from going, from utility to NREL to industry-specific leadership roles?
So the American Bioenergy Association was interesting because that was the woman who had the government relations role, who said you should try this, it's fun, had left, and she had started that organization. So when I was looking at what do I want to do next, she said, hey, why don't you come help me run this group? So we were co-directors. We were doing things like, trying to do biomass gasification. And these were things that were still kind of in the research phase, but needed good policies. We were working on cellulosic biofuels, and we were up against the corn ethanol industry, which is just a losing proposition. And we were small. We were trying to get things done through public policy. We had some success, but that was kind of my first foray into an industry coalition and working with industry players to try to get something done collectively. And that was fun because once you understood what they were doing and could make a case for what they were doing and why it was important, then trying to get it in public policy was that was the challenge. Like, how do we build the case then to people who may not understand this and may not believe in it the way we do, and get them to believe in it and make champions out of them? So that's when I did that.
Just before you move on, so what I'm interested in is sort of the role and how you balanced running and building a small organization, doing the coalition building that you needed to do, and also, were you also actually doing policy design?
We were doing policy design in that we had to come up with proposals for, what would work in a renewable fuel standard for cellulosic biofuels. How do we get this in there? How do we, what is the right policy for this? And that was when I started working on state renewable portfolio standards with Maryland and New Jersey. The governor asked me to be on a task force, and I was doing this on behalf of biomass, really, to try to ensure that biomass was included as one of the renewable energy technologies that was qualified.
Right, which is it not always is in state RPS.
No, it's a stepchild for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. Explain why that is.
Well, because it still emits, right? Biomass is still an emitting technology. And so, even in gasification at that time was very nascent. So a lot of this had to do with co-firing with coal. And it does clean up coal some, but I would not be a proponent right now to say that's the best thing you should do. We really should just shut the coal plants down.
So talk about the other groups that you were involved with. You went on, I think, from the Bioenergy Association to the Gridwise Alliance?
No.
I got the order wrong?
So actually, yeah. I went to Good Energies.
Okay.
So
tell me about that.
After American Bioenergy Association, I had my fourth kid, and I took a couple of years off to make sure that everybody was okay on the home front. And I was called by a friend who had worked at Department of Energy and knew me and said, hey, I'm worth a private equity company that just invests in clean energy. It's called Good Energies. And the CEO was Richard Kaufman, who ended up going on to be the energy czar in New York State. And we still stay in touch. Yeah, he's still the chair of NYSERDA. And so I said, that seems pretty interesting. And it was ostensibly to do public policy. But what I really ended up doing there, and I was only there a little over a year, was due diligence on their portfolio companies because I understood the technology and I kind of got the nexus of where that technology had to go from a policy standpoint. So I wasn't out there working on public policy. I was really looking at their portfolio companies and trying to figure out how did they work and did they have a market for it based on policy. It was really interesting and I loved it. They had about a $6 billion portfolio. And great companies, some of whom I had kind of known about. And so I was familiar with the technology. And it was from there that Gridwise Alliance recruited me. And again, this was all about who I knew. It was because the person who kind of started the Gridwise Alliance, who's now the president of it, Steve Hauser, had been my boss at NREL. And he said, oh, yeah, you should come run this thing. And it was all about smart grid and about trying to get smart grid funding into the stimulus bill because we needed to do something to jumpstart the economy. And these were technologies that utilities weren't willing to bear the full risk on, but were willing to do 50-50 cost share. So that was really one of my big projects was how do we educate people on what smart grid technologies are in 2008, 2009 timeframe, right when the stimulus bill is being written, and convince Congress that they need to fund them.
How did that go?
It was actually great. Part of it is that I was able to get one of our members, Kima, to do an analysis of prospective jobs given X amount of stimulus money. And so they did a report. They showed, hundreds of thousands of jobs could be created if you put billions of dollars into this. And I was called to testify before the Senate. I presented my report. They put those numbers into the report language of the bill. And at that time, they gave the program $11 billion, about 5.5 of which went to utilities. And at that time, $1 billion was a lot of money.
Yeah.
So that was great because we were able to.
It's a huge win.
Yeah, it was considered a huge win. And we got some things at that point in energy policy that were really important and are still important today, like standards for smart grid interconnection, things like that I think are still critically important as that industry moves forward.
Have had a lasting effect. And can you just sort of describe the state of smart grid implementation now? What does the market look like?
So I think smart grid technologies continue to be deployed. We are certainly in much better shape than we were then. Remember, we were coming off of 2003, the big blackout in the Northeast. I was in my cabin in the Adirondacks at the time, and we have blackouts all the time up there. And my husband was on the modem on the computer, and he said, I don't think we're the only ones without electricity. And we weren't. That would not, and it took a year to figure out that it was a branch in Cleveland that caused the entire grid to go down in the Northeast. And that would not happen today because we have sensors that have been deployed, these synchrophasers that are out there now. I think some of the physical technologies are out there working really well, but honestly, the vast majority of deployments were in smart meters. And smart meters have been out there. They're great for collecting data. I still don't think utilities have figured out
how to use the data.
Best to use the data. So I think it's still in progress.
Okay, so from smart grid to energy storage, yes. How did you arrive at ESA? So energy storage was always super interesting to me. Remember, I had done that at the utility back in the 80s. We did ice storage, and one of Good Energy's portfolio companies was an ice storage company. So I was really intellectually interested in it. It was the Energy Storage Association, which was actually called the Electricity Storage Association at the time, was like a science club. And they were, a group of the nicest, smartest guys you could possibly work with. And I said, guys, we need some policy. So I convinced them that policy was going to be really important to deployment. And some of the policy would be, directing the Department of Energy to provide technical assistance to utilities and others. And some of the policy would be in the form of tax credit. And
I have been working to try to get the investment tax credit for energy storage forever.
And it looks like it's about to happen.
It might get over the finish line this year.
Right now, but yeah.
Not thanks to me, but to my business partner who's like kind of taken that on and has just done a huge amount of lifting to try to get that over the finish line. But at that time, energy storage was still considered just like a, wow, don't you wish this would really happen? And over the last, 6-8 years, it's just grown exponentially. It's been pretty incredible.
Can you describe the array of approaches and technologies within energy storage? Because we think about batteries, and that's probably where most of the thrust is these days. But you mentioned ice storage. There's water pumping. There's a range of technologies.
Yeah, most of the storage in the world is pumped hydro. So it's that was built to provide demand services to baseload generation like nuclear plants.
Describe how that works. It's when I first got the concept, I was like, wow, that's so simple and so brilliant.
So you pump the water up to the top lake at night, and then during the day when demand peaks, instead of having to ramp up your baseload generator, you just run the water through the hydropower plant, and that accounts for your demand. It's a really elegant, simple, really great concept. So that's a big piece of it. That's not because, remember, this was the Electricity Storage Association at the time. They did not focus on pumped hydropower, in large part because the Hydropower Association, NHA, did that. That was really their thrust because they have very different issues. Tax credits, sure, but their big issues are on siting and permitting. That's always been the hydro business's big issues. So we were really trying to get things like flywheels out the door and all kinds of chemistries for batteries. And for batteries come in a lot of different chemistries, not just lithium ion. That's the one that's come down the most in cost and is the most prevalent right now, but there are a lot of other chemistries. And then the other was flow batteries. So there are lots of different types of technologies out there. I think there continue to be. Some have fallen by the wayside. Some other new ones have come into being. So it's been a really interesting field to be in. And I think there's still room to grow. And there are now seasonal storage companies that are building huge, basically chemical plants to try to manage the seasonal differences in renewables.
Where do you see the main thrust or the most interesting areas of technological development in storage moving forward?
So I think a couple of things. If you think about the consumer side, I think things like virtual power plants, which is what STEM and other companies like that are doing, where energy storage is a service, not just a battery that supplies for one customer, but that you're able to aggregate all these batteries into something that becomes really to the grid, a power plant, but from the consumer side. That's super interesting to me. The other end of it is this seasonal storage, which would, rather than having to, if you're going to 100% renewables, rather than having to overbuild solar and wind, because there are differences in winter solar versus summer solar. Instead of having to overbuild, based on what your worst case scenario is for solar, why not use a seasonal battery that can cycle just a few times a year or a few hundred times a year and accommodate the seasonal change?
It's essentially peaker storage.
Yes. And I think between those two on the supply side and what is the demand side, but is also another type of supply side, you would then have a grid that would be able to be 100% renewable.
Right. Which requires, there's all sorts of software and analytic implications to make all that work.
Yes. You have to overlay this with this, information technology and data-driven ability to really, from a granular level, manage very local needs and very local resources.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned being part of developing Maryland and New Jersey's RPS. And I know that in your work over the years, you've obviously worked with states because states all have such varying approaches to energy and environments in implementing these technologies. Today we are in a federal government environment that is retrograde when it comes to environmental policy, at least. And people are looking to states and to companies to kind of fill the gap. are they filling the gap? Are, sort of the broad category of subnational actors filling the gap?
So they are filling the gap in some ways. There are a couple different gaps, probably a lot of gaps. But states, cities are, in a lot of cases, taking on the mantle of, all right, well, we're going to go 100%. The issue is that our grid also has cross-state border implications and wholesale markets. So luckily, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, my favorite federal agency, is that everybody knows that's my favorite federal agency, sets the rules for that. And I'm hoping that they're going to provide, they provided an energy storage order, but I really want them to do a distributed energy resource order also to allow participation of aggregated distributed energy resources into the wholesale market, whether it's through the utility or directly into the wholesale market. So I've been working on that. There's this fine line between, you want states to be able to have their own policies and decide we want to go 100% renewable or not. So that you do have really good state wins, whether it's through an increased renewable portfolio standard or some other, carbon policy that a state might have. So you want them to continue to move forward on that without being restrained in any way. At the same time, there's this need for everybody to be moving in the right direction on carbon. I feel like the biggest gap is in our global leadership, because the U.S. is the innovator to the world. Innovation comes from the United States. We have the most amazing entrepreneurs. We have the best, incubators and other laboratories and universities that everyone in the world wants to come and work in and be part of. And yet we have ceded global leadership from the top, from a climate perspective, and we're not at the table. And that is so frustrating because people still want to come and innovate here. But unless we decide that as a nation we're going to move forward, we're not going to have a seat at the table. And a lot of that innovation will just die by the wayside, unfortunately.
Yeah, and it's so different than, enterprise software or social networking companies that require relatively low capital costs without government participation and participation at the policy level, both in terms of investment and policy. Some of these technologies that require much higher capital costs aren't getting the juice they need to get to market.
That's right. And utilities are also changing. So Xcel Energy, AEP, a lot of these utilities have said, we want to go 100% clean. But they don't also have a marker. The Clean Power Plan going away, that provided certainty to utilities to say, all right, now we're going to need to really invest in this direction and really do our integrated resource planning based on what this particular future looks like. And that marker's not out there. And I think that's not helpful. It doesn't provide certainty to utilities.
So why is a utility like Xcel creating a 100% clean energy target? Is it in response to states that are doing the same? Is it in anticipation of the next administration, or is it just kind of floppy and doesn't really have legs without that federal mandate?
So I can't get inside Xcel's head, but I think that part of it is to get ahead of the states already in their service territory are starting to move to 100% clean. So trying to get ahead of it and saying we're a leader, and they want to chart their own course. They want to decide how they're going to do it rather than being told how they're going to do it. I think that's really important for utilities to try to do, is to say, all right, we're going to try to figure out how we're going to change and move forward. Xcel is focusing very much on the supply side and on the generation side. So with wind and solar, but not as much on the demand side. So that's a lot of what I do, is spend time with either companies in that space, or I run an association called the Advanced Energy Management Alliance that's all about distributed energy resource. And we're going state by state, utility by utility, saying, look, think of us as a resource too. Think of, rather than just building generation, also thinking about resources on the supply side to balance it out.
Mm-hmm. And do you see this trend among states that are creating 100% or at least very aggressive clean energy targets. California, obviously, Washington State very recently, Puerto Rico, Illinois is talking about it. Is this a trend that's going to continue?
Oh, I think it'll definitely continue. Yes. There are always going to be states that lag. And unfortunately, those are sometimes the states where they really need it the most because they're the states that probably have the poorest population and the most to gain. But I do think that this is moving in the right direction.
And is this sort of a substitute for a national price on carbon or some type of carbon mechanism, or is it setting the table for some type of national cap and trade or carbon tax program?
So I feel like most of them are different mechanisms. So closest to what a lot of the states are doing now is more like an RPS or a clean energy standard, which a bill has just been introduced in the House and Senate for another clean energy standard. And this was introduced back in 2008, 2009. It passed through the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. So it came, a little step closer to getting through Congress at that point. That was at the same time that Waxman-Markey was going through the House, and that was a cap and trade. That was just a different model. I just think since 29 states and DC have RPSs, that is an easier mechanism for states to understand and implement. So I feel like that is going to be the first step in a climate policy in the near term. It doesn't mean to say that over the longer term we'll need a carbon tax, but in my mind, that's a lot gnarlier to enforce. It's easier to do something that people know how to do, like an investment tax credit for solar, a production tax credit for wind. Those are things that people know how to do. They know how they work. They know how to execute on them, and they know what the outcome is going to be. And I think the same is with an RPS. I think people understand how that would work. Now there's some differences because now we have many more technologies on the demand side where, maybe you need to get credit for having flexible resources on the demand side too. Have some credit. Right now, the bill tries to include energy storage. Maybe not in the most elegant way, but that all needs to be included. So all the integration technologies and the software solutions should probably be included and given some kind of credit in a federal standard. But remember, when this administration started, they stopped the Clean Power Plan. They stopped as much as they could of us moving forward to an energy transition that the rest of the world agrees we have to get to.
Right.
And we have to do things quickly that we know how to do. I just think a carbon tax is going to be a lot harder.
Yeah. And I wonder also, we talk a lot about cap and trade and price on carbon in California and have, tried to kind of spread the gospel. And it seems actually to be taking hold in a couple other states on the West Coast and provinces in Canada. But I do wonder if it's even the right policy at this point, for the reasons that you're talking about. It might be too top down. It might be too hard for different actors, both states, federal government, and businesses to embrace and get behind.
It's also really easy for a government to come in and decide not to do it. You look in Australia and every year the next premier comes in and says, no, we're not going to do this. Or yes, we are going to do this. Or no, we're not. So
it's almost more vulnerable. As a single top-down policy is more vulnerable than kind of a bottom-up variegated approach.
Exactly. So I think if we do things that we know how to do and we know what the outcome's going to be and do more of that faster, I think that's going to be the quickest, easiest thing to do.
And in some ways, that's kind of what happened with the Paris Agreement, is that rather than going towards Kyoto-like targets, it gave countries range to develop their own mechanisms and their own approaches. Although the success of that approach is still sort of out to be determined.
That's right. People are behind on their goals, and yet the goals are still there, and they're still being held accountable. So I think that's the most important thing. The countries know that they're not meeting them right now, and that they need to try to do things differently. I think goal setting is super important. So in my mind, having that or the Clean Power Plan, which did really the same thing for states, that said states can figure out how they're going to meet these targets, but we need to meet them. I still think that is a really, really important thing to do.
So I want to use that as a segue just to broaden into the international context a little bit. You co-chair a committee within the World Economic Forum that focuses on advanced energy technologies. Tell me about that work and what you're kind of learning about approaches outside of America.
Oh, it's so fascinating. And it's affirming in a lot of ways. It's affirming that the U.S. is the innovator of the world, but it is also affirming that we are really stepping back from global leadership. So there are kind of two sides to the coin. This is the third council that I've been involved in the World Economic Forum. The first was the Future of Electricity Council. I was the vice chair, and that was about 5 years ago. And I walked into the room and I said the words energy storage, and everybody laughed at me and said, that's not a thing. All right. Now energy storage is just a given. So that was only 5 years ago. The second council was the future of energy. And then I walked in and said blockchain, and everybody yelled at me and laughed at me. So technology is moving a lot faster than we've been thinking it would move. And that's a really good thing. So the Advanced Energy Technology Council was created to say, all right, so what are those really interesting different technologies that we need to get us to this energy transition? Not just what does the future of energy writ large need to look like. So we spent a day listening to really interesting presentations from a lot of different technologists about what's out there. And in the end, we decided, you know what? We've got what we need. By 2030, we'll have everything we need to meet the transition. And 2030 really being the date by which we better be on the right track based on the IPCC report. Like if we're not well on the way, we're pretty much done. So we have to use that as our marker. And we know we have all these technologies either in the queue, like they're very quickly coming, and we know they'll come if we set our targets in the right way and incentivize what we have already and learn from each other. So part of what we're trying to do is figure out what are the policies that have worked in different regions. And let's collect those and share them and make sure that everybody understands what works and what doesn't work and learn from each other. So for example, California did the energy storage target. They made targets for utilities, giving utilities a mandate, or you could call it permission to put RFPs out on the street for energy storage. That not only created a market for storage, it created this whole ecosystem, 200 companies moving to California to start doing energy storage. They've way surpassed their goal. They've been able to shut down gas plants and peaker plants because of that. So I think, if we can collectively understand what are the best policies that get you to X outcome and do that faster. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So that's what we've been starting down the road for, and making sure that there's a platform for sharing those real case studies of real things that work, not just by technology, but by policy. Like what is a policy that you can put in place that will change the way you're using energy?
And which countries are leading the pack? If the U.S. is falling behind, where do you see innovation, both on the technology and policy front, really taking shape?
So China and India are moving quickly. India has done a lot to the point that some of their solar developers are saying the cost of solar is so cheap we can't make any money. I mean, that's how fast they're deploying. China also, they don't have to worry about any kind of democratic process. They just deploy. They've deployed thousands of gigawatts of renewables. Now, of course, they're also building coal plants, which, at some point they're going to have to shut those down. And there will be stranded assets on some level. But they are creating the market for EVs. There are almost 500 EV companies in China alone. So those countries have taken on the leadership, and have then incubated other kinds of companies to then deploy elsewhere. But I look to other countries in Europe, like Denmark or Sweden or Norway, Germany, UK, who've experimented with a lot of other things too, and have really moved forward quickly. So I think there are a lot of different ways to do this, and a lot of countries are moving forward. I mean, everybody in the world is moving forward on an energy transition because everybody else in the world believes that we're in an existential crisis for the future of our planet.
Yeah, and we tend to have our heads in the sand. So I want to talk a little bit about career. And, we've been talking about your career, and you've had this incredible journey of being a creative writing and wanting to write children's books and studying culture and civilization at the Sorbonne. You and I will talk later about our and intertwining paths. I've also studied creative writing and so on. But from that academic background to really rolling up your sleeves and understanding and being able to implement energy technologies and programs, and then transitioning into this incredibly rich policy career where you're operating really at the highest level internationally and in the US. So there's a lot of people, I talk to a lot of, as I'm sure you do, a lot of young people, especially, who do understand the existential crisis that we're in, and they want to apply their waking hours to solving this crisis. What opportunities specifically do you see, and what also sort of general advice do you have to people who are just starting out?
So you just can't get from A to Z instantly. You really, rather than laying out your career, I think of it as be willing to take risks, be willing to work on what you're passionate about, know how to write. Writing is the most important skill you can have.
Yeah. So, talk a little bit more about that. I mean, that's, people might see careers in energy and environment as being best suited for people with a STEM background. But my experience, and it sounds like your experience, shows that a solid background in writing is really important. Why is that so important?
Because you need to be able to convey your idea. You need to be able to distill, if you're working on policy, you need to distill something complex into something that anyone can understand. And writing clearly is so important for that. It can convey your mission or your passion, but it can convey something very technical in other terms. And I remember when I was at the utility, I got an award. I got one of my consumers that I had worked with on energy efficiency to get an award. And honestly, they didn't do anything any better than anybody else, but I wrote a really good application for them. And I convinced everybody that they were amazing. And that was because I was able to write about it, not because they necessarily did anything any better than anybody else. So I think writing is incredibly important. But I also think policy is simply a means to an end, right? So policy is just the way that you either build a business or a technology or a mission, and it's not for its own sake. So I always tell people, learn how things work, whether it's at a utility and learning how the grid works, or whether it's going to an investor or a VC and learning how financing works. Whatever you want to do, learn how the business works, because if you don't know that, you won't know what policy is going to help it. Jumping right into policy is really difficult because you've lost all that other piece. Now, there are a lot of people who still do that. So a lot of people, my co-owner of our business, my business partner, came off of Capitol Hill, and he worked for a member of Congress. So he learned a lot about a lot of different things. But there's some catch up to be done on what the technology does. I mean, he's brilliant on all of our policy strategy. But, coming from different backgrounds is good. Working with people from different backgrounds is good. But I always tell people, learn how things work, no matter what it is, so that you will understand what the linked policy is.
And we've talked about some of the specific big opportunities that are out there right now. But if you were giving advice to one of your kids or one of their friends in terms of focusing on one of these sectors, that high impact sectors that can actually move the needle at the gigaton scale, what's interesting to you? Where would you point somebody?
I love that right now young people are super interested, and there's a lot of grassroots energy out there. And I think that can be activated in a lot of different ways. So you could go the route of being political. You could go run for office, start getting politically active. Or you could go into a really interesting software field. So do something that's, like we really need distributed energy resource management systems. Like we really need to understand how all this stuff is going to work together. If you're interested in software, that is a great place to be. If you're interested in hardware, maybe new solar technologies or smart inverters or systems that integrate wind or energy storage. All of those are super interesting. I don't think I would pick one. It's like I have a bunch of kids and I don't love one of them any more than another. And so I think there are just so many ways to help us save the planet. And I think if you're one of those people who wants to do something, there's so many different ways to do it, and just find what interests you the most.
So I want to go back to the communication piece for a second. And I'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little bit about Energy Gang, of which I've been a huge fan for years, and is one of the things that kind of informed and inspired this podcast. But the climate story has been one that's really difficult to tell. And we keep kind of wrestling with, oh, we should make it sound better than it is. Oh, we should make it sound worse than it is. Oh, it can't be a climate message. It has to be an economic message. There's all these different kind of pivots. And we still, in the US in particular, really struggle with getting people on board with both the urgency and the sense that they can act. How do you see specifically just the podcast medium, the sort of storytelling medium in its ability to affect change?
Oh, I think podcasts are amazing. I spend a lot of my time listening to true crime podcasts, quite honestly, because they're an escape for me. But they really are great storytelling media. And since they're evergreen, you can just listen at any time. You can go back. You can go and look up one of the most interesting people that you interviewed and hear all about their journey. There are just so many ways to access it. And it really is about telling a story. And I think on climate, it's even more than that. I have found that, and this is probably just human nature, that humans have a hard time looking into the future and thinking that what they do today is going to affect that future. And especially with climate, where it seems so big, it's like, well, I can't do anything about that. It's huge. What do I have to do about it? It's the coal plants. Just shut all the coal plants down. But you actually do have something to do with it, not just from your own actions, but what you do on a daily basis and who you're around and how you sow the seeds for other people to act too. So I feel like everybody has a part of it, and we need to make sure that everybody can help in some way, and that we don't leave people behind, that we're not losing the support and all of this talent on industries on which our economy has been built over the last 200 years, but that are now find themselves out of jobs. So how do we make sure that we include everybody in this and make sure that it's a very inclusive, equitable move forward, and that everybody has a piece of it, and that everybody feels like they have some ownership and ability to make a difference?
So what you mentioned other podcasts, and if maybe a podcast or two and a book or two that you would recommend to people who are interested in taking action?
My go-to podcasts are like The Daily from the New York Times, because I need to know what's going on in the world. And they are really good at explaining things in a really crisp way and digging a little bit, but not too deeply that I can't get it. There are so many great folks out there that have been writing and talking about these things. Quite honestly, I spend a lot of my time, because I do so much research for the Energy Gang. I spend a lot of time reading and interviewing people to try to inform me, to make sure that I bring, my best ability to the show every single time. That in my leisure, I'm reading like Tana French mystery novels. Like I just, I still can't get the creative writing out of me. So I'm going to go back to my room tonight and read Anthony Horowitz. Like I'm going to read something that is not about energy, because that helps feed me. And quite honestly, reading good writing is the best way to be a good writer, is reading someone who really knows how to write. Yeah. And I don't know, technical books is not.
Well, we also, I think the human brain, in order to synthesize, needs a lot of input. Yes. And, I find I read a lot of poetry. And, poetry is such a different way of seeing and sensing the world, and distilling like these micro and sometimes big truths that are out there. And, when you spend your day in whatever field you're in, ingesting large amounts of, technical or specific information, it's really important to give your brain wider space.
Absolutely. And that's been, quite honestly, the most beneficial thing by being involved in the World Economic Forum and getting to go to Davos for several years. When I go there, I spend a lot of time, of course, working really hard on what my job is for them, but a lot of my time doing things like day in the life of a refugee experience or going to art exhibits. Or last year, there was all this piece on technology that can help people who have other types of abilities. So people who can't hear wearing a piece of clothing that allows them to feel the music, like experimenting with that. That to me has been the most enriching thing. Is like there are all these other places where human beings have impact that I want to learn about, even though it's not my specialty and I'm not going to ever be an expert. Just learning about it, learning what happens elsewhere in the world is so important.
So as we wrap up, I want to come back to something you mentioned, which is the latest IPCC report and the 2030 sort of deadline for bending the curve down of carbon emissions globally. This is really serious stuff, and other people in other countries, particularly youth in other countries, have really awakened to the urgency of the situation. Do you think that we can make it? What is your outlook?
I wouldn't be here if I didn't think we can do it. I absolutely think we can do it. We have to have the political will to do it. We have all the technology to do it. We have all the smarts. We have all this is not about technology. It's about, in some ways, utility corporate culture. We got to change the business models. We have to change the way we're doing business, but we also need the political will to do it. I think we have the grassroots will to do it, but we need it from the top. I think we can do it. Otherwise, I wouldn't have 4 kids and have that be my main goal in life, which is really to make sure my kids are okay.
Yeah. Well, Katherine Hamilton, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge today on the podcast and for years through Energy Gang and through all the work that you do. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, David. It's been really an honor to be here.
The Sustainability Leaders Podcast is a resource of Jobs with Impact. Our engineer and associate producer is Ian Swanky. Theme music also by Ian Swanky. I'm David Rosenheim. If you like the show, please tell your friends and give us a rating and review on iTunes. See you next episode.